Belgrade, in late October, held a particular smell. River moisture overlaid with diesel and the faint, organic sourness of overfilled bins. Kalemegdan's stone ramparts cut the sky into hard angles. Pedestrians moved in small, deliberate flows, where tourists and locals braided past each other, ignorant of the calculus unfolding among them. Mikail Petrov walked beneath the fortress shadow, as if the stones themselves measured his steps. He carried a paper bag of bread, hands wrapped around it like a man holding a relic, and his shoulders were always a little too high for his frame. Someone watching might have read only age and habit. Those who sought patterns saw the tremor of a man waiting for a verdict he had already written. Before the river and the stones, before the watchful eyes of 3 intelligence services stitched themselves into a net, there had been months of attrition. Petrov had been a functionary of the apparatus for decades, an interrogator whose name did not appear on honor rolls, but did circulate in the internal complaints and after-hours whispers. He was heavy-set, 50 by appearance and habit, with whiskey teeth, and a resentment that had calcified into a quiet, relentless hunger. Reports prepared for foreign hands later catalogued his virtues and his vices: competence, cruelty, complaints about being passed over. Phrases that sounded like clinical verdicts beside the personal rot that had led him to a different calculation. According to debriefs and a tangle of field reports, he had crossed a line, not merely disillusioned, but compromised by fear of indictment after internal accusations, and driven by the thought that the only safety left was outside the walls that had sheltered his career. This account draws on those fragments: archival cables, post-action Mossad debriefs, and interviews with operatives who still spoke in flat tones about choices that had cost friendships and alliances. The record is partial and partisan in places. Where certainty does not exist, the narrative will note the difference between what sources asserted and what could only be reconstructed. That caution, however, must not flatten the scene. The story of how Mossad moved against the KGB's most feared operative in the presence of both Yugoslav security and a wary CIA is at once a tale of small, cold decisions and a study of how allies navigate overlapping interests when the stakes are the lives of agents and the reputations of states. If you want the full reconstruction, down to the timing of the van, to the exchanges that occurred in whispers and in radios, we'll go through it step by step. Stay with the story to the end. Subscribe and like if you find this reconstruction useful, and leave a comment on the ethical ties you see between intelligence and diplomacy. Now, the moment in Kalemegdan. Mikail felt the cold on his cheeks and entered the square as if expecting trouble and accustomed to it. The path he had chosen that afternoon was unremarkable. A bench near the confluence where the Sava met the Danube. Children at play on an out-of-season carousel. 3 men in a line that could be any trio. An old friend, perhaps, a businessman, a baker. In the surveillance logs later read by foreign eyes, those 3 men would not remain anonymous. They were Ahud's team, a small unit from Mossad with precise roles. The leader, a surveillance specialist of wiry build, whom the others called Levi. A driver who kept his face blank and his hands steady. And a communications operator who pretended to read a newspaper while her fingers traced the outline of a radio hidden beneath the paper. Ahud watched Petrov first from the shadow of a poplar, Then from the narrow rear seat of a diplomatic van with plates that offered immunity without guaranteeing safety. He had the look of a man who had balanced many small untruths until one true thing broke across the surface. We are responsible for our own. He had been a field leader long enough to understand that bureaucracies could be counted on to hesitate. The CIA was in Belgrade through formal channels, and an embassy that published schedules and constrained action with layers of diplomatic caution. The Yugoslav security apparatus watched its own streets and its own informants. Mossad had reasons to move without full American consent. According to later cables and memoir fragments, the Israelis believed that the calculus of risk, the likely torture, the probable exposure of assets favored immediate intervention rather than a diplomatic wait. Petrov did not know the names of those who tracked him. He understood only that his steps were an examination, that every breath could be read as confession. He had been careful in recent months, calls through indirect lines, visits to parks over offices. But bureaucracy corrodes secrecy in ways that habit cannot repair. A year of small exposures had become a single luminous danger. The lead-up to the operation was not cinematic in the way novels describe epiphanies. It was a steady accretion of signals. A Mossad station in Europe had received an initial cable. An internal KGB complaint flagged an interrogator, Petrov, after a breach that suggested he might be susceptible to recruitment. Subsequent meetings between handlers and a source in Belgrade escalated the classification. He had expressed willingness to switch sides, but hedged publicly and privately at different times. The source's notes, once filed and reread, carried phrases that read like a confession and like an excuse. I am done with fear. They will ruin me. I need out. It is in these human half-statements that agencies decide whether a person is a recruitable asset or a file to be closed. Ehud assembled his small task force in a rented flat 2 blocks from the Danube. The room smelled of boiled coffee and cigarette ash. A map of Belgrade lay on the table, a coarse pencil line marking routes along riverbanks and approaches through alleys. Ehud's voice was economical. We move on 3 cues, he said, not because precision would make the world safe, but because it organized chance into intervals they could complete. They planned for contingencies they could name: Yugoslav patrols, civilian interference, communications jamming, and accepted unknowns they could not prepare for. They expected that the Americans would advocate delay and legal channels. They expected the KGB to be present in the city, both visible and invisible. They expected everything that an operation in 1971 Yugoslavia would bring: narrow streets, the odor of coal smoke, an intelligence architecture that moved in its own secret currents. Mossad surveillance was old-fashioned in its carefulness. Teams took turns with telescopes, with the boring but necessary patience of footwork and patience. They recorded Petrov's habits, which bench he preferred, which kiosk took his small talk, where he kept a secondary set of keys. The communications specialist kept tabs on frequencies and neutralized transmissions that might betray them. They rehearsed exits and routes, not like soldiers reciting lines, but like men and women practicing breathing in a storm, a rhythm of actions that, if followed, would produce the expected outcome. Meanwhile, the CIA watched with a different grid. The station chief favored a formal approach. Get Petrov to the embassy under controlled circumstances, then request asylum to avoid a violent breach of Yugoslavic sovereignty. The CIA's more cautious path made sense when filtered through the discipline of public diplomacy and legal protection of a station's reputation. It also made enemies in Mossad. The Israelis argued that the diplomatic route increased the probability that Petrov would be detained by Yugoslav security once the KGB learned of his intentions. In back-channel memos that would later appear in reconciliatory accounts, the CIA used phrases like legal constraints and potential diplomatic fallout, while Mossad countered with its own calculus of immediate physical risk to living assets. On the day chosen for the operation, the coordination between Mossad teams took on a brittle intensity. They knew the KGB had watchers in Belgrade, men who moved like smoke into spaces where they had no right, and that the Yugoslavic security service, often cooperating quietly with Moscow, would not be an indifferent presence. Mossad's team therefore layered itself into the city in a series of invisibilities. A diplomat's van with neutral plates, a driver who blended in with other traffic, a surveillance pair who shadowed at a polite distance. They established a safe house in a nondescript building near the river where a Finnish embassy visa might be issued, legalities to hide true intent and, if required, false paperwork that would help move a stranger across a border. Petrov arrived at Kalimeddan with all the contradictions of a man who is both hunted and hopeful. Ehud's surveillance logged him at 14:12, sitting with both hands on the bread. He moved his eyes like a man who read faces for threats and mercy. At 14:27, the communications specialist reported a subtle change. A KGB tail was present nearby, language and posture that matched Moscow's manners, an exchange of cigarettes and a glance that registered like a challenge. Mossad's operatives tightened. They watched as Petrov rose to leave, as if pulled by a decision he himself had made the night before. For Petrov, the act of walking away was both a small rebellion and a test. He did not have a plan to escape the country. He had, at best, the hope that someone else would provide an option. As he moved, the square became a stage, and the stage a trap of possibilities. Ehud effected a minute hand signal. 2 fingers brushed his wool collar. Levi, the wiry surveillance man, crossed the lawn at a measured pace and jutted a cigarette in his mouth, a civilian affectation that softened suspicion. The driver eased the van forward with diplomatic plates like a promise of neutrality. The first near miss arrived as a pedestrian conversation that was, in intelligence terms, a red flag. A KGB observer, thin and deliberate, paused at a kiosk and spoke in Russian to a man who smelled of cheap aftershave. The exchange was short. The kid's book of tales noted that the observer had been observed in other meetings with Yugoslav ciphers. For the Mossad operatives, this was confirmation. But it also compressed the window of movement. The CIA had a different read. They believed arrest would be the likely outcome if Petrov were to be openly spirited away. Their cable recommended a diplomatic extraction. Mossad's orders were simpler. Remove him from immediate KGB influence before interrogation could produce leaks, and before Yugoslav security could fold him into an institutional process. The interception was surgical and ugly in its quietness. Ehud's team closed the perimeter in 2 moves. A small squad of local auxiliaries, men with plausible ties to couriers and street vendors, moved into the space between Petrov and the river. They created what looked like an accidental bustle, a dropped bag, a clumsy bump. Petrov, attuned to social friction, turned instinctively to help. In that split second of attention, his stance loosened, and a hand, gentle but decisive, slipped a small pack into his coat pocket as if tucking away a document. The action was a signal, a pocket of safety. Then the van crossed the cobblestones, a neutral presence in a neutral city, and Ahud stepped forward with the practiced calm of a man used to rewriting outcomes. He engaged Petrov in a tone of friendly deference. "Old friend, the weather is a calamity," he said, a line that in its banality offered cover. Petrov, suspicious and exhausted, listened while Levi's surveillance kept an eye on the KGB man's line of sight. What happened next was a matter of seconds and judgment. Petrov looked past the small talk and into the eyes of the man. Decision and survival traded like coins. He stepped toward the van. A hooded figure, Yugoslav, perhaps KGB, moved toward them as if to assert authority. For a breathless moment, time reconfigured into angles. The distance between Petrov and the car, the position of the KGB observer, the shout of a child from the carousel. Ahud waved the driver forward, and the diplomatic plate offered an argument that none of the men in uniform outside that bubble could easily rebut. The CIA's reaction, according to later station notes, was immediate and wrapped in formal protest. Their station chief asked for notification, for delay. They feared that a clandestine departure could rupture relations and endanger their own informants. Mossad answered with its own dispatches. The risk of Petrov's immediate interrogation and the likely exposure of assets justified the action. It is the nature of alliances that languages of caution often meet languages of urgency, and in those spaces, decisions become acts of sovereignty. The van's engine hummed. Petrov slid into the seat, breath shallow. The KGB watcher cursed under his breath and began to move toward the driver. But the diplomatic plates and the presence of 3 burly men with solid stories on their faces offered a buffer. The van eased forward and merged into Belgrade's stream of cars. The heart of the operation was not the van itself, but the choreography, a convoy of civilian vehicles that appeared unrelated, each carrying a facet of the escape: documents, false passports, a smokescreen of plausible errands. Inside, Petrov's breath fogged the glass. Ahud sat across from him and offered water in a plain paper cup, the small civility of operational kindness. Petrov's hands shook. The old interrogator had become the vulnerable thing he had once seen in others. He did not speak much. The conversation consisted of small confirmations and the exchange of names that felt identical to the ones he had used for years. "You understand what this means?" Ahud asked, voice stripped of spectacle. Petrov's answer was slow and honest. "I have no illusions." They moved through the city with a practiced patience, slipping past streets where Yugoslav patrols threaded the night, and past the familiar faces that had known Petrov's name for longer than he had known his own. The driver kept the van near the river, taking routes that hugged the water as if proximity to the Sava could hide them in its indifferent flow. At one point, a Yugoslav checkpoint flagged a diplomatic vehicle. The driver produced papers, a neutral smile, and the van, by right of false administrative ballast, passed. Mossad's communications array kept them in constant low-light contact with a safe house 2 neighborhoods away. The team had planned an arrival window, 20 minutes to the flat that would be their triage point. They expected Yugoslav inquiries. They prepared for them with layers of stories. They did not expect the climbing irritation that would radiate from the U.S. station's diplomatic office, telegraphing a set of cables that would later embarrass and, for a time, strain cooperation. At the moment, though, only the van's rubber and the river's edge mattered. When the van eased into the narrow lane that led to the safe house, Petrov's face registered the relief and fear that always follow escape. He did not know how long this protection would last, nor how much of his past the various services would exploit. He did not, in that moment, think of diplomatic rows. He thought only of the small human relief of not being under immediate hands. Inside the flat, the surveillance specialist performed a quick sweep while Ashahud and the communications operator arranged for a simple meal and a bed. They listened for the city's soundscape, voices drifting up, a tram's distant bell, and measured time as a kind of fragile currency. News would flow in after the fact. CIA memos terse with exasperation, Yugoslav inquiries formal and angry, KGB reactions cold and methodical in Moscow's archives. For the moment, however, the operation was a sealed sequence of breaths. The van's driver, the soft click of the safe-house door, Petrov's hesitant step into a room he had not known he would see from this side. The room smelled of boiled coffee and bleach. A radio murmured an idle program tuned to an innocuous frequency. Ahud lit a cigarette out of habit and put it down without drawing overmuch meaning from the flame. He had secured his primary objective, Petrov out of the park, in a flat, in the immediate safety of a team that could keep him alive long enough for harder choices to be made. The exfiltration across the Belgrade streets in those minutes had one shape: decisive, small, morally congested. The CIA would later criticize Mossad for acting without full coordination. Mossad would later cite the immediacy of risk that inaction would have invited. Petrov himself remained the ambiguous center, a man whose past had been built inside rooms of coercion, and whose present was now a doorway to another life. The river flowed on, indifferent, where confluences met and parted as if to show that even great currents ultimately brushed and then moved on. They had won the first act of the plan. The cost, the diplomatic murmurs, the internal reckonings would come. For now, Ahud closed the safe-house blinds and began to plan the next move. Debrief, verification, damage assessment. He knew the operation would send ripples through the networks, some small, some sharp. The team moved with a weary competence. They had performed their trade. But even as they prepared, a nervous signal arrived on the comms. A CIA frequency had been heard probing, an ally's voice in a different register, signaling that American patience had frayed. Ahud took it as proof that cooperation with allies was never a single unified thing, but an accretion of interests that sometimes collided. He would, in time, have to answer to those collisions. For the moment, the room's thin curtains kept out the river's reflection, and the flat offered the shape of a temporary sanctuary. Beyond the windows, Kalamegdan's stones kept their patient watch. The fortress cast its shadow across the city like history itself, solid, enduring, and indifferent. Inside the flat, a man who had spent his life breaking down secrets now sat with a cup of tea and the knowledge that his own life had been broken open and repurposed. The choices ahead would require paper, patience, and the tough arithmetic of bargain and favor. The operation's first victory had been simple: remove the operative from immediate danger. The true work, what to give, what to demand, how to hold safe a man who had been both perpetrator and prey, remained. When Ahud finally spoke, he did not sound triumphant. He sounded like a man who had made a decision and now must account for it. "We get him verified," he said, voice low. "We see what he brings. We see what he cost." Outside, the river continued its indifferent course, where Sava met Danube, and the city's lights blurred in the flow. The next hours would bring analysis, and with it the uncomfortable arithmetic of alliances. The Americans would not be pleased. The Yugoslavs would make inquiries. The KGB would register the loss. For the Mossad team, the immediate task was narrower. Keep Petrov alive, confirm his information, and prepare the paths that might carry him out of a continent where Moscow's reach had teeth. They could not yet know how far the ripples would spread. They did not know whether the intelligence Petrov claimed to possess would validate the risk. They only knew the immediate fact. A van had moved through the city, a man had entered its doors, and the fortress's shadow had swallowed him, chosen for now to protect the secret of the flat rather than to expose it. The operation had been a gamble, not in the bright light of grand strategy, but in the dim rooms where people made decisions about lives, reputations, and the sovereignty of allies. They settled into the night with the watchful fatigue of survivors. Radios hummed, a kettle clicked off. Petrov lay on a narrow bed and closed his eyes not in sleep, but in a kind of exhausted calculation. Outside, Belgrade breathed in and out like a living system that could not be stopped by one operation, no matter how sharp its success. The next day would bring more dangers. The debrief, the assessment of what Petrov could reveal, the diplomatic pressure that would soon arrive with formal cables and pointed questions. The story was not finished. It had only begun to show its true cost. Dawn came thin through the blinds, as if the city itself hesitated to wake. Inside the flat, the air had the stale, metallic smell of too many people in a small room and too little sleep. Petrov sat up when Ahud entered, hands wrapped around the chipped mug the team had found in a kitchen drawer. He had the look of a man who had learned to measure danger in the pulse of a heartbeat. His eyes were small, quick, and refracted by calculation. "How do we prove you are what you say?" Ahud asked without ceremony. He placed a small, battered notebook on the table, a plain thing, once belonging to some courier, now home to a cipher and a dozen pressed receipts. The flat was quiet, except for the distant traffic and the faint creak of the building settling. Petrov considered the notebook, then the faces around the room. Rami, always watchful. Laleh, the team's analyst, rubbing at her temple. A young operator Ahud had taken on to run comms. "Proof is not a single object," Petrov said slowly, in accented but fluent Hebrew. "Proof is a trail, a pattern, a name that cannot be explained away." He produced, with hands that trembled just enough to remind everyone of his frailty, a thin roll of microfilm wrapped in cigarette paper. The team looked at it as one might look at a live flame, dangerous, alive with consequence. Petrov allowed that he had kept copies, that he had been cautious. He spoke of a courier route that ran from Moscow to Vienna to Bucharest, of drop points at border inns and a code sewn into the hems of uniforms, of files that moved between safe hands like contraband breath. Ahud listened. He had heard variations on this before, an ex-agent's map of betrayals, a litany of names. What mattered now was verification, crossing this man's map with what satellites of knowledge Mossad already held. Laleh took the microfilm with gloved fingers. The lens on her loupe caught the thin spiral and enlarged it into letters and stamps. Names that could be checked. Dates. A signature that matched a cipher key Mossad had catalogued years earlier. "One name," she said finally, and the single syllable cut the air. To have part of one's suspicion confirmed was both relief and invitation to more danger. Ahud felt the old arithmetic return. The more certain the gain, the higher the price likely to be. They worked until the sun climbed and the flat grew warm. Petrov spoke of operations he had watched from the inside, assassinations planned on paper and abandoned by compromise, shipments rerouted through dead nations, agents who had married and had children under false names. He did not confess to every cruelty. The details he offered were the ones that could be turned into leverage, and he was adept at bartering what he would reveal for what he would receive. By mid-afternoon, a signal arrived on an improvised frequency. A voice clipped American. A hooded presence at the edge of their map. Ahud had expected the plea that would come from the west. What he had not expected was how quickly it arrived. A man in a gray coat waited across the street, watching a bakery window as if pastry were the business of intelligence. He crossed when signaled and introduced himself as Agent Miller. He had the smooth efficiency of someone trained to make pressure feel like reason. His eyes regarded Petrov not with compassion, but with interest tempered by corporate caution. "He's valuable," Miller said without preamble, as they stood pressed between a parked tram and the building's shadow. "You know that. The Americans can offer immediate extraction to a safe house in Italy. Full debrief under our supervision. Protection. We're willing to accommodate your needs in exchange for access." Ahud watched his face, felt the old muscle memory of negotiating with allies. "Access is not a service to be bartered," he said. "It is a matter of survival. We need verification first. Then we decide how to move. Your patience has limits, I understand. Ours is not thinner." Miller's smile was a thin blade. Patience runs out when exposure turns into action. The KGB will notice a missing man. The Yugoslavic services will ask questions. We can move faster than you think. The offer was as much threat as promise. Ahud heard his team's soft intake of breath and saw Petrov's fingers tighten around his cup. The ex-GRU man, who had been the object of these negotiations, watched the two men perform their ritual like a priest examining a coin. He had, after all, orchestrated his own flight. He was not entirely without agency. Back inside, the debrief continued in fragments. Petrov's information, once run through Lale's filters, yielded a list of targets and safe houses, a pattern of radio checks and bank transfers. Some names were already known to Mossad, agents compromised long ago, people dead or exiled. Others were new, lead after lead that could be chased to dislodge a whole network. The clearest jewel among them was a set of coordinates and a name tied to an ongoing operation in Beirut, material that would, if confirmed, change immediate operational priorities. "It would justify risk," Rami said quietly. He looked at Ahud as if offering a scale, what we gain versus what we risk. "And what of his past?" Lale asked. "He was part of campaigns that cost lives. There will be moral questions we cannot avoid if we protect him." Ahud felt the weight of those questions like a physical thing upon his chest. He imagined the families of those whose names might be on Petrov's lists. He imagined, too, the faces of his men should a compromised operation go wrong because he miscalculated. Leadership, he knew, was the ugly work of choosing which wrong to accept. Outside, the city moved through ordinary motions. Children with satchels went to school. A tram shuddered past a market stall draped with produce. History, Ahud thought, kept happening to other people, while men like them diverted trains of consequence by stealth. The afternoon small consensus was this: Petrov would be kept here under guard, while Mossad conducted its own verification. They would not hand him to the Americans until their own questions were answered. The CIA liaison's irritation was palpable. Miller left with the promise of continued communication, and a look that suggested patience thin enough to snap. Night, when it came, brought with it a different kind of sound. Footsteps in the stairwell, a voice speaking low in Serbo-Croat. Ahud's trained ear caught the cadence of uniforms. Someone knocked at the door twice, in the polite pattern of officers making inquiry. Lale paled, and Rami moved to position himself between the door and the rest. Petrov, who had spent a life knowing how to be invisible, had one last instinct left: to stand and smooth his shirt, to make himself ordinary. It did not protect him. The knocks came again, firmer. Voices requested entry, citing a matter of routine inquiry from local authorities. Ahud walked to the door and peered through the peephole. Two men in plain coats, neither carrying obvious insignia, but both with the grave, bureaucratic composure of state servants, stood below. One held a notepad, the other had a face that seemed to have been shaped by long hours at an interrogation desk. "Tell them we'll answer at the window," Ahud murmured. "No entry." He turned and, with a practiced calm, opened the window that looked down on the street. He could see the two men now, their breath small in the evening air. Through a crack, one of them spoke, in passable Hebrew. "We have reports," he said. "A man seen with foreigners. We only ask for information. It is all routine." Ahud considered the trap. Routine was rarely routine in these streets. It was a door ajar that invited others to notice the gap. He could offer the truth, or he could offer an alibi, or he could manufacture a reason for the visitors to move on. Each option carried consequence. He chose a half-truth. "A tourist had a bicycle stolen 2 blocks away," he said. "We're awaiting his report. We'll come down in a little while." The man with the notepad looked unconvinced, but not unmoved. He nodded, as if filing the small oddity into a ledger of curiosities, and the two men moved away, lingering at the corner as if to prove their capacity to return. When the door closed and the flat exhaled, Ahud felt the day's thin illusions fall. The fact remained. Every step they took broadcast signals into networks that watched for aberrations. They would not escape notice forever. Petrov's presence had already carved a route of attention through the city. He sat again opposite the man who had once assisted in making other men's lives small and secret. "We verify," Ahud said, repeating the formula that had steadied him all day. "We choose our partners. We decide what we are willing to risk." Petrov's smile was an expression of something between fatigue and relief. "I am not asking for mercy," he said. "I am asking for a chance. You must decide what you will do with what I offer." Ahud understood then that this was the true bargain. Not paper or passports, not safe houses or flights, but the shape of his own nation's future moves. He would have to sign the terms with his eyes closed, perhaps. It was not the first time a man's signature had been written in the dark. Outside, Kalamegdan kept its patient watch. Inside, the flat's single lamp burned on the table where the microfilm lay. Small, bright, a promise of consequence. In the narrow hours that followed, the team drew plans on a pad. Verification channels, cover stories, contingency for compromise. They would run Petrov's names against databases, test the microfilm in different labs, and feed controlled leaks to see who would flinch. But no plan held in the face of human impatience. At 2 in the morning, a terse message arrived from an unexpected source. A courier, breathless, with a single line scrawled on a scrap of paper and folded into a cigarette case. The message contained 3 words in Russian and 1 name. Ehud read it twice. The name was a node he had not expected to see in Petrov's files. Someone close to a sensitive channel Mossad had relied on for years. Its appearance was not only a verification, it was an open wound. He covered the note and sat very still, like a man listening for a sound that would tell him the direction of a bullet. The decision he faced had ceased to be about extraction routes. It was now about trust, about whether to believe a man who had once been the instrument of betrayal, and whether to expose a seam in his own house that, if tugged, could unravel more than one operation. He looked at Petrov, who had, in those small, precise gestures, revealed the ruinous geometry of his life, and the possibility of saving others by giving away those secrets. "Tomorrow," Ehud said finally, "we start." Petrov inclined his head. "Tomorrow," he agreed. Outside, Belgrade slept, unaware that inside a nondescript flat, the calculations that would rearrange the lives of many people were being made in a dozen small human decisions. Ehud's next moves would have to be synthetic, part truth, part deception, because the intelligence world had no pure choices left. In the thin light of that night, they all rehearsed the lines of compromise. The river flowed on, sanguine and blind. Men with maps of other men's lives gathered their maps around a table and began to redraw the borders of trust. They had bought the night. The morning would belong to consequence. Dawn came pale and thin through the single window, painting the microfilm on the table with a cold, merciless light. For a moment, the room seemed to belong to another century. Men huddled around a sheet of glass, while outside, the city woke and resumed its ordinary betrayals. Ehud poured coffee with hands that did not tremble, but that held the steady, small violence of a man conscious of doing wrong for a necessary end. "Bring the viewer," he said. Lena, short, pragmatic, who had once taught chaotic youths how to keep a rifle steady, set a battered enlarger on the table. Margin cleared space, folding a map of the city like a conspirator smoothing a flag. Petrov watched them as a man watches a wound being inspected, with a face that made no sound, but that registered every movement as if it might be the last kindness he received. The film itself was smaller than anyone had dared hope, and contained more. Rows of numbers, a smudge of diplomatic cipher, and, in the center, a narrow column of names. Lena rotated the wheel, and the names grew into letters. Ehud read aloud, precise as a surgeon. Kovac, Mira. Sokol. Channel, Vienna safe. Drop, cafe at the bridge. Timestamp. He stopped. Petrov exhaled something like gratitude and something like terror at the same time. Mira, Petrov said, in a voice almost swallowed by the room. She was careful. Mira Kovac had a whisper history in the team's files. An asset who had been a ghost in European train stations. A courier whose face had appeared in briefings and been scrubbed out of them. If the microfilm named her, if it tied her to the Vienna channel the Mossad had relied on, then every step she had taken might be retraced. The ledger was not a simple list of names. It was a map of shoulders that had carried secrets. "We do not run to our employer with this," Ahud said. They set about triangulating. Margin fed the names into a lattice of contacts. Old men in safe houses, currency exchanges, the tiny, illegal couriers who moved through Europe's back alleys. Lena made a list of labs in neighboring cities that could verify the film chemically without leaving a paper trail. Petrov, when asked, gave nothing but small, precise replies, like a man afraid to enlarge his own voice. Hours passed in the motion of work, calls made through payphones, a parcel left at a consulate door, a face recognized in a market and followed 2 blocks, then deliberately lost. The team cultivated delays as if they were prayers. Each pause preserved someone else's life. At midday, a message arrived from an address that made Ahud loosen. It was from a deferred channel they had not used in months. A ciphered line, 3 words. Freeze, no move. Ahud read it twice. The sender belonged to the network that had once been their protector. The message suggested alarm and a hand on the throat of the channels they had assumed steady. Someone higher up had felt the tug and had pulled. "We are not ghosts," Marjan said. His voice had the brittle edge of a man who had watched too many things go badly to welcome mystery. "We are nodes. When one trembles, the rest may burn." There was no consensus on what to do. Petrov's presence complicated the calculus. He could be the man who knew where the matches were kept, or he could be the spark. Ahud could not afford to treat him as entirely one or the other. The intelligence world, he reminded them, rarely offers absolutes. It offered degrees of risk, measured like currency. They needed proof of compromise, but they could not verify without moving material into channels that might be watched. Ahud proposed something precarious. Use the microfilm as bait. Plant a controlled leak. Let a demonstrable copy of the ledger find its way into a place where those who watched will blink. If a handler reacted, the pattern of that reaction might reveal who had access to the film outside their circle. Petrov's eyes lit for a moment. "I can arrange a meeting," he said. "They will come if they believe they can buy their way out." "Or into us," Lena countered. "We set a snare. We must be ready to close it without letting the wires cut what hangs from it." They worked the plan as men who know the delicate arithmetic of danger. A hooded envelope would be sent to a disreputable cafe by the river. Inside, a forged copy of the microfilm would be left beneath a sugar bowl. Petrov would broadcast a rumor, carefully scripted, that the original was now in Belgrade. They would watch to see who came and from what direction. A reaction from Vienna would mean one thing, a local hand would mean another. Either way, they would not sprint blindly toward revelation. Preparations completed, the flat fell into a taut, expectant silence. Petrov paced the length of the room twice and then returned to the table as if the table were the only steady thing in a world tipping. "You will be watched," he said softly. "Not only from without. They have ears inside some houses you think are safe." Marjan's laugh was a dry exhale. All houses have ears. The question is whether those ears belong to friends. Tomorrow, Ehud said, we let the bait go. Tonight, we test duplicates, we scrub tracks, we sleep like thieves. Night approached with the plain insistence of traffic, and the lamps along Kalamegdan beginning to blink like a ring of tired stars. They moved with the economy of men who knew how to make nothing look like the plan it concealed. A false copy pressed into an envelope that also contained a newspaper clipping about a local soccer match. A courier, small, nondescript, who would not be remembered, given instructions to leave the envelope at the sugar bowl precisely when an old woman requested sugar. Petrov agreed to play his role with the nervous devotion of someone who had nothing to lose except perhaps the one self he had constructed to survive. He practiced lines with the same methodical precision that Ehud had once used to build alibis. Short, plausible, unadorned. As midnight approached, a sound came from the stair. It was the kind of clumsy, confident approach that belongs to men who think their uniforms will grant them sovereignty in any doorway. Ehud glanced at the clock and then at the others. Lena paled. Petrov did not move. He had a look that was not of fear, but of recognition. "They have come early," he said. Ehud felt at once. A hooded shadow filled the threshold, and two figures stepped into the flat. Not the men at the corner. They had not come alone, and this was not the press. One of the newcomers wore the insignia of the local service on a lapel that caught the lamplight with a dull, bureaucratic gleam. "We received a tip," the man said in Serbian. His voice was official, the kind that suggests it has been measured by committees and given the imprimatur of righteousness. Ehud's hand moved like thought. Slow, careful. "You were here last night," he said without accusation, and the man at the door made no attempt to deny it. "We return where the trail leads," the officer answered. "No more than routine, you will understand." Petrov's face drained of color. His fingers curled around a cigarette case in his pocket. The scrap of paper folded into it, a small and terrible proof of connection. Ehud felt at once the old geometry of the city and the new. A net closing with silk threads. "Sit," Ehud said. It was not a command, but a soft, strategic invitation. He did not want a physical confrontation. He wanted the men to speak, to reveal the size of the hand that had reached for this flat. They sat. The officer produced a small notebook and a pen, and for a while the room settled into an uneasy, bureaucratic pause while the men spoke in the thin language of inquiries. Then, outside, two rapid knocks came from the corridor. 3, as if the knocker were someone who did not trust doors to keep strangers at bay. The officer at their table stiffened and opened his mouth. But before a word could be formed, there arrived a new voice, low and urgent, that belonged to no uniform. "They have moved the meat. They're on the bridge. Hurry." The officer's hand tightened on the notebook. He looked toward the window as if to see across the river to Vienna itself. For an instant, his official mask slipped, and Ehud saw behind it the flicker of a man who feared the geometry of his own station. "It begins," Lena whispered. Ehud's mind measured options faster than speech. If the meat had been moved, if forces were converging at the bridge, then decisions had to be made in the smallest of increments. Which truths to divulge, which to conceal, which to give up like coin to buy a pause. He rose and moved toward the window. not because he expected to see the scene, but because movement hardened his thoughts into strategy. The city lay below, roofs blistered by the sun that had not yet fully taken the sky. The Danube, an indifferent artery. The bridge would be a crossroads of choices. "You will not leave," Ahud said to Petrov, though there was no threat in his tone, only the cold arithmetic of containment. "You will stay here. If they go to the bridge, they will go because they believe it's safe. If they chase from other doors, we will know which doors they trust." Petrov's nod was a small thing, like the closing of a wound. He understood too well. The officer rose. He had the posture of a man who believed the letters on his lapel gave him sway. "We will take a statement," he said, "and then we will check your papers." Ahud's mind offered no easy path. Papers could be forged. Statements could be co-opted. What he needed was movement, a trail left deliberately, a reaction catalogued and understood. He saw then the only possible course. Sacrifice the copy in the sugar bowl. Let the meeting at the bridge occur, and watch who came with what kind of step. The question that had been pressing at the back of his skull all night, who would risk everything for this ledger, would be answered in the way others move to claim it. "Do what you must," he said aloud. "But know this, we are not a house to be plundered at leisure." The officer's smile was all civility. "Of course," he answered, "we only seek the truth." Outside, on the street, a car engine coughed to life, and then died. Something shifted in the city's long breath. Ahud felt it as a man feels a shift in the weather, small, inevitable, and charged. As the officer began his formalities, Ahud's eyes met Petrov's. In that instant, both men understood the ledger's impossible calculus: betray some to save others, or refuse and risk all. The choice, always the same right in their line, would have to be made in degrees, and with a careful patience that tasted faintly of defeat. The knock at the stair repeated once more, louder now, as if impatience had grown a voice. The officer's pen trembled slightly as he wrote. Beyond the thin walls of the flat, the city rearranged itself in silence.